32 ticks following. So they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow 2 will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale Kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Welcome. My name is Adrian Harewood, and I'm the host of the 6 o'clock news at CBC Ottawa in Canada. I'm also host of a weekly program also at CBC called Our Ottawa, and I'm delighted today to be interviewing the Canadian writer Esi Edugyan. Esi Edugyan was born in Calgary, Alberta, the daughter of Ghanaian parents. She studied creative writing at the University of Victoria, where she earned a BA, and she later earned a master's degree at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. She is the author of the novels The Second Life of Samuel Tyne and Half-Blood Blues, which won the 2011 Scotiabank Giller Prize, Canada's most prestigious literary award. It also won the Governor General's Literary Award, the Rogers Trust Fiction Prize, and the Orange Prize. It was also a finalist for the Man Booker Prize. Esi's third novel, Washington Black, was published in September 2018. It won the Giller Prize in November 2018, making Edugyan only the third writer after M.G. Vasanji and Alice Munro ever to win the award twice. Washington Black was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, and the 2019 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. It gives me a great delight to welcome Esi Edugyan to the Ake Festival. Esi, it's great to see you.
It's really great to see you too, Adrian. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Esi, I thought I'd begin this way. I thought I'd begin by getting a sense of your origin story, because as I mentioned at the outset in the introduction, you were born in Calgary, Alberta, born in 1978 to Ghanaian parents. I was first of all curious as to how your family arrived in Calgary, Alberta in the 1970s.
Yeah, it was a bit of a circuitous route. So my parents, they actually didn't know each other in Ghana. They met in California. My father won a scholarship to study at Stanford, which I think is in Palo Alto. And then my mother was doing a nursing course, and a friend of theirs was hosting a party one evening to watch the moon landing in 1969. And he invited all of the students from the African diaspora that he knew. He himself was, I can't remember where he was from. But my parents were both invited, and they met, and I think their courtship was only probably about 6 months long, which is, if you think about that today, that just seems insane. But I guess it was meant to be, and they ended up marrying very quickly, and then I guess settled down in California, and that's where my brother was born, and then my father eventually had an opportunity to do some postgraduate work at the University of Alberta. So they picked up and moved to Alberta, to Edmonton. And that's where my sister was born. And then they eventually moved to Calgary, and that's where I was born. And they used to joke that they stopped moving because they didn't want to have more kids, because every time they moved, they had a child. But they settled in Calgary. I think they liked it there, and that's where my father still lives to this day. He's 80.
We know that Calgary is the center of Canada's petroleum industry, its oil industry. It was booming in the 1970s. I'm curious as to what it was like being an African immigrant family in Calgary in the 1970s.
Yeah. I'm just one perspective on that. But I will say that for me, I think Alberta is a very different place now. It's much more diverse than it was when I was growing up in the 80s. So there was a sense of being both very much, I guess, tied to certain cultural aspects. I mean, my father worked for the provincial government. There was all that, but but also I think we felt very much outside in a lot of ways, just because obviously, there were certain cultural features of my own household that, as soon as you left, you took a step outside the house, things were very different. And yeah, so there was always that dichotomy, but you sort of felt as though there was a duality there. But that was an interesting way to grow up, I think.
Mm-hmm. You've talked previously about feeling or being somewhat disconnected from your family in Ghana during this period. You didn't have that kind of regular communication necessarily, and I'm wondering, like, how would you describe your relationship with your Ghanaian family, and how did that shape you?
Yeah, I really didn't meet my Ghanaian family until I think it was 26 years old, 26, 27. And I was living in Germany, and my family decided, because they were all going to come over and visit me, and it was like, well, wouldn't it be amazing to just get on a plane and fly to Ghana, because it's obviously so much closer to leave from Germany than from Western Canada. And so that's what we did. I flew with my father and my brother and sister over to Ghana, and we kind of traveled all around the country. And it was really eye-opening for me. My mother had passed away back in 1997, and we really, she was extremely close with her sisters, but we weren't really privy to those relationships. It was something sort of getting played out, almost like, behind a curtain or something. We really didn't know. And so to go to Ghana and to meet her siblings, one of whom was like the carbon copy of her. They just looked so similar. It was like this sort of way of, I guess, communicating with her, although she wasn't there. You could see so much of her and her sisters, and so it was very moving in that respect. And likewise, similarly, my grandmother, like my father's mother, we hadn't grown up with any grandparents around us. It was always just the five of us in Alberta, and so to be able to meet all of our cousins and aunts and uncles, and especially my father's mother, they thought she was 103. They weren't quite sure, but they kind of carried her out, and she was completely blind, and we didn't speak a common language, but we could still somehow communicate. And it was this amazing moment, and also to see my father with his mother, was really, really incredible for us, because you have a sense of your parents as being these kind of monolithic figures, especially when you never see them interacting with their own parents. They just seem as like all-knowing figures. And so to see my father with his mother, and kind of expressing this vulnerability with his mother, was really, really something. And yeah, it was very moving.
So you're almost 30, and you return to the ancestral homeland.
Or arrive for the first time.
Or for the first time.
Yeah.
Or arrive for the first time, or I should say,
Yeah.
arrive. Did you feel as if you were back home?
I think we felt, and I'm speaking on behalf of my siblings as well, I mean, there were features of the culture that were very familiar. You'd grown up eating all of, the same foods and hearing these languages spoken, although, we never spoke Chi. It just wasn't somehow, I don't know, my parents didn't get around to teaching us. I don't know what it was, but, we were very we could understand a little bit. And, there are just all of these things that were so much, had been so much a part of our lives growing up, these features that were intensely familiar. At the same time, we understood that we were not, we could never just sort of pick up and move there and feel completely at home. As Canadians, we felt very intensely Canadian, and others let us know that we were other in a way. They looked at us and they didn't, they saw Canadians, and that makes great sense. And so, yeah, it was this weird, I guess, perspective of feeling instinctively and innately attached to certain things, but also feeling very much as though you were outside of things and you were alien to this culture, and that you couldn't fully claim it for yourself because you were an outsider.
Mm-hmm. You say that you were an outsider when you went to Ghana, but you've also said that you always felt like an outsider in Canada. Do you claim Canada too, or can you claim Canada too?
Yeah, somehow, this is where I was born. This is where I grew up. This is where I've lived. Almost my entire life has been lived in Western Canada, aside from a few. I mean, I lived in Toronto for a year, and I lived in Europe for a couple of years, just various countries. And it's almost like kind of living in those other places, and I include Eastern Canada in this. It was just very much brought home to me how much I am, a Western Canadian. Like, this is just something that's has so defined who I am. Even though I would say that those ancestral ties to Ghana are still something that that I feel strongly, and they'll always be there. But yeah, I do feel myself to be very much a Western Canadian.
And yet,
all of that outsider status.
Yeah,
So,
well,
yeah. It's
talk about that outsider status. What does it mean? What does it mean to be an outsider in the place you call home?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I probably struggled with growing up. That this was this feeling of being kind of disconnected from the mainstream, or standing outside of things, was something that really bothered me as a child and growing up. But now I don't feel like it's, it hasn't hampered anything. If anything, it gives you a different perspective. And I'm sure that there are people who feel like outsiders for all sorts of reasons, who would sort of understand what I'm talking about. Just this idea of always constantly looking in, I guess, from the margins, and assessing things from that perspective. And I think it's something that I've really carried back into my novels. If I look at the 3 novels that I've done, these are very much books about people who do not feel themselves to be at the center of things, and are looking for a way to, or they're really looking for their place in the world. All 3 of those main characters. And I would say that probably none of them really finds the perfect place. But it's that search, and that kind of, I guess, what you learn in about yourself and about the larger culture, in this kind of delicate dance that you're doing, wanting to be closer to the center than pulling back, and all of that. I think that there's a lot of insight to be gained from that, and I think that's why all of my books have been written from those perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Being an outsider can result in one being self-aware. It can also result in one becoming a keen observer of the human condition. And also, it can help one to understand how power works. Do you think your outsiderness has helped you to understand power?
I guess so. It's hard always to speak in, about something like in abstractions in a way. To understand power. I mean, what is power? It's like I have the answer to that, but it's so many various answers to what power is. But I guess I understand what it means to look like, what it looks like to not have power, and to all the various ways that a lack of certain what's the word? I don't want to use the word power again, but just
Agency?
Yeah, I guess to have a lack of certain
Ladder?
agencies. Yeah, agencies. So whether that's something like being able to govern oneself and what you can sort of expect to get for yourself or gain for yourself, because there are certain things standing in your way, um, or whether that's something that's actually codified into law, something that's kind of keeping you from being able to realize something that's within you to achieve. Like you can achieve something, but there's something that's very solidly standing outside of yourself that's keeping you from realizing that. I mean, there are just so many multifarious ways that power works. It's yeah, there are the ways in which you feel intensely that you are powerless, and in some ways that's something that you are committing against yourself, and in other ways it's there are actual sort of external I guess statutes keeping you from realizing what it is that you can achieve. So I guess maybe that outsider status has given me a sense of that, but I mean that sounds very grandiose. I don't know that I would put it that way.
Your ability to write and your ability to communicate effectively has given you a measure of power, in this society. But I want to go back a little bit and ask you when you realized that you wanted to write, that writing was, for lack of a better term, your thing.
I think I recognized very young that I enjoyed writing and that it was something that I could potentially do. I remember writing I think it was like a tiny little short story for like an English class and getting a lot of praise about it and bringing it home. And my mother had thought that I had copied it out of a book, which to me was like the highest praise. Like if she thought that this could actually have come from a printed book, then it must, it can't be too terrible. But, it wasn't something I had really set my sights on to do. I didn't think that it was necessarily something that was available to me as a profession for various reasons. But, when I was graduating from high school, I was like, it was just implicit that I was going to go and study at a university. And, I really thought, well, what can I study? And I had a really great English teacher who had sort of directed me towards the University of Victoria because I had a very strong writing program there. And, I didn't know if that was going to be sufficiently, if my parents were going to think that was that was going to be enough. So I promised to study journalism, and my mother was delighted with that because she was just worried about me financially, how I was going to take care of myself, and I did end up studying journalism, creative writing, and a little bit of visual art. And then I ended up, very quickly after the first semester, kind of just concentrating on creative writing, like poetry and fiction, and that's where it all came together for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you think about those books as a young kind of emerging writer, developing writer in your teens, heading into your 20s, when you think about those books and those authors that were foundational for you, who were they? Who are they? What are they?
But I remember, I guess, reading, initially letting my reading be directed, obviously, by what was going on in my classrooms. So, I took an advanced placement English course, and I think we read George Orwell. We read 1984. We read Mordecai Richler's Apprenticeship with Lenny Kravitz. We read a lot of Margaret Atwood. I remember being very going away and reading basically her entire oeuvre. And then, as I was sort of moving to go to creative writing school, I started reading. Somebody gave me a copy of Crime and Punishment, which had always seemed like this daunting thing to read, and I settled right into it, and I whipped right through it. It's such obviously it's, it was a lot more accessible to me than its reputation had, had sort of impressed upon me. I really took a lot. I was only like 17, so I wasn't obviously taking everything away from it that I could have taken, but it made a huge impression on me. And I remember, then going away to read the Brothers Karamazov and then getting into Tolstoy. And one of the things that, I was so taken with reading Anna Karenina was just the vibrancy of Tolstoy's characters and the way that he could write. Obviously, he could write anyone and make it convincing. He could write from the perspective of a 4-year-old girl. He could write from the perspective of an old man who's been a peasant on the land for 70 years, and everything was just so vibrant and convincing. And I thought, I would like to try and do that. I would like to try and create characters that are just hugely alive, and and that's something I'm still learning. I'm still working on it, but it's that to me, I think as a writer, was just a very seminal moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on in university, I had some really wonderful people kind of directing me towards Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and all of these Black female writers, and it was just, again, that was another awakening, and it also kind of gave me the feeling of permission that, okay, somebody is writing these stories, and maybe I have something to add to that conversation.
Your stories, your books are very much rooted in history. You've been called someone who has mastered the art of historical fiction writing. To talk about the kind of effect that studying history has had on your ability to write fiction.
The ironic thing is that I was never a great student of history when I was in school. I was probably the worst student of history that many of those teachers had ever seen. I just, I didn't care in a lot of ways, or it's like I couldn't. There was something about the way the material was being presented that was profoundly boring to me. But then I found, as I got into university and could kind of tailor my own reading and choose, make some strong choices in the books of history that I was reading, I found that, I was extremely interested in, various, particularly the history of initially the history of the 20th century surrounding the Second World War. That became intensely something I was very much constantly reading about, and to come across certain stories that touched on the war that I hadn't sort of heard about. This was an eye-opening thing for me. And with my first novel, The Second Life of Samuel Tyne, it was finding out that there had been slaves who had settled, I guess, central and northern Alberta at the turn of the 20th century, who'd come up from Oklahoma, because they'd been disenfranchised, and were looking for, new lives on the Canadian prairie. And, that was really illuminating to me, because in terms of, African Canadian histories on the prairie, I didn't know that it had gone back that far. So I think, and then with Washington Black, that was another era of history as well. And I think, I've always just been interested, when I come across something in a history book where the story feels to me just untold, or like I haven't seen it before, or I haven't heard about it. And, those are the kind of the bits of history that stick in my mind. And then I end up really doing a deep dive and seeing what I can find out.
Mm-hmm. Another famous Canadian book and author, talks about, or his story takes place in Barbados during the time of slavery. Of course, I'm talking about Austin Clarke's The Polished Hoe. But I'm wondering where your story, Washington Black, came from. How did the story come to be?
Yeah, so Washington Black was originally going to be a novel about the Tichborne claimant trials, which really have nothing to do with slavery in Barbados. It's, it was, I think all of my novels maybe start in one place and then tend to, through various drafts, end up somewhere different. But I originally thought I was writing about to this infamous series of criminal trials that had taken place in England from the 1860s right into the 1890s, and so almost 30 years of litigation. And they centered around the disappearance of a young man called Roger Tichborne, who was the scion of an extremely wealthy family from the south of England. And he went missing at sea, he went on a pleasure tour, and then his ship was found, capsized and half destroyed off the coast of Brazil, and everybody was presumed dead. But his mother was extremely attached to him, and she refused to believe that he died. So she consulted a clairvoyant, and the clairvoyant told her that in fact her son was alive and well and living in a sunny land far away, and she just had to put some effort into finding him. So she did this. She put notices in newspapers all around the world and got a response from a small town called Wagga Wagga in Australia, which was a man claiming to be her son Roger. And she was delighted, and she was ready to send him money for his passage home. But she recognized that the rest of her family might need more proof than just this man's letter. So just by chance, a man who had worked for the Tichborne family, whose name was Andrew Bogle, had retired to Sydney, Australia with his sons. And he had known Roger since Roger was a kid. So she asked him if he could go and just, make sure that this was her son. And Bogle agreed to do so. And Bogle ended up, traveling back with this man to England and helping him try and get his inheritance that he was seeking, even though this man was clearly not Roger at all and didn't look like him and had none of the features of Roger. And so I thought that was really fascinating. But as I came to write the story, I realized I was much more interested in the Bogle, in Bogle as he was as a child, who his story was so interesting. He was a slave on a plantation in Jamaica that was owned by the friend of the Tichbornes. And so when a member of the Tichborne household was visiting that friend, he saw Bogle, who was 11 years old or so at the time, and took a liking to him and decided to steal him off of his friend's Jamaican plantation and take him back to England as his page boy. So he did this, and Bogle was a page boy, and then he was a valet, and he traveled all throughout Europe, and he eventually retired to Australia. So he had this completely different life than the one that was intended for him as a slave in Jamaica. And, I thought that it was so fascinating to me, this idea that you would have had a sense of yourself as a slave boy as being, somewhat expendable, as your life as being, not something necessarily all that worthwhile, a feeling that it would be something maybe quite short-lived. Obviously, you would have had a certain notion of the possibilities of your life, in that situation. And so to be taken out of that and transported to worlds that he could never have conceived of when he was, that boy on that plantation, I thought, well, that's what's more fascinating to me, rather than all of these crazy details of these multiple trials that went on forever. This shift in psychology, and and what kinds of things would he still be carrying into his new life, even though he was, I guess, technically a free man. What sort of psychological trauma would he be bringing to this new life? It's just, interesting to me.
Well, Washington Black tells the story of George Washington Black. It begins in the year, 1830. And George Washington Black is 11 years old. He is an enslaved boy living on the Faith Plantation. He is owned by a gentleman named Erasmus Wild. And Erasmus effectively gives George Washington Black to his brother, Christopher Wild, who is an inventor and who is interested in science. And George Washington Black ends up serving as Christopher Wild, or Titch's, assistant, helping him to engage in his scientific pursuits. And together they eventually managed to escape from Barbados, from the plantation. Their relationship is a very complicated one. It's very complex, and I'm wondering, how should we understand the relationship between Titch and Washington Black? What should we make of it?
Yeah, it's a relationship that's constantly evolving and shifting, and for me, that was what kept it interesting. Is that they meet in a situation that's very fraught. So Titch has come to the plantation. He believes himself to be this great abolitionist, and he's come to the plantation ostensibly to make notes that can then be used in Parliament as a way to bring an end to slavery and the slave trade. And but he's somebody who, having said that, he's somebody who's still very comfortable using slave labor to build this scientific contraption, this cloud cutter that he's wanting to bring to fruition. And so when he meets Washington, his initial impulse, I guess, in bringing this young man to live with him is that he sees him as being physically maybe the right size for the person that he needs to help him man this contraption, man the cloud cutter. And so it's purely I guess a selfish reason, and
he wants to exploit him.
Yeah, it's a very exploitative reason. So he brings this young man into his home, and he is surprised to discover that Washington is very capable and, in fact, extremely talented when it comes to scientific endeavor and such. And so, this is something where his thinking shifts a little bit. It's changing. He's surprised, and so I would say that the relationship starts on a level of great imbalance. There's a huge power imbalance. You've got this young boy and this young this young Black boy, slave boy, and this older white gentleman. And when I initially gave the book to some early readers, they had this kind of fear that, oh no, this is going to be a white savior narrative, and just like this feeling like they didn't want to have to read an unsavory book, I guess, and so there's really that power imbalance, and then you start to see the ways in which Washington's his extraordinariness really starts to shift Titch's thinking about him. And so he garners a measure of respect from, I guess, from this man, as though, and that really starts to change Washington's sense about himself. But ultimately, it's something where he really has to ask himself, does it really matter what this man thinks of him? Because he doesn't really feel as though he was really fully embraced as an equal. And this is something that comes to very much bother him later on in the book, because really Titch has this kind of paternal role to play with Wash. He's sort of like this father figure, because he has taken Washington away from Washington's initial parental figure, which was a woman called Big Kit, who was sort of this motherly figure for him and his only source of love. So he's really broken up that last tie that Wash has to a sense of family. And so Washington only has Titch to turn to. But there's continues to be this strange push and pull between an admiration, a real regard for each other, but also this continuing imbalance between them, because Washington, is and has been a slave, and that awareness is always there between them. And then, even though they're extremely like-minded men, like if they were to meet in a different era, in our era, you get a sense that these two would be extremely great friends and extremely respectful of each other. But that power imbalance of Titch coming from where he's from, which is this very aristocratic slaving family from England, and Washington, obviously having been born a slave on one of Titch's family's plantations, this is a relationship that never fully manages to be equal. And that's something that really comes to haunt Washington later on in the book.
They can never really be friends?
I think given the power imbalance, it can never be a true relationship of equals. It could be sort of a shallow friendship or whatever, I guess, which, it was on the surface. But in terms of actual respect and regard that goes both ways, and, which is the foundation, I think, of all meaningful relationships, is a deep respect and regard for the other person, even if you don't always agree with everything that they believe with. I think that mutual respect has to be there, and that's something that just can never, as much as Titch tries and as much as he feels himself to be an enlightened man, it's something that he's just not able to move beyond that, I think.
Washington Black has an enormous amount of respect, admiration, love for Big Kit. You mentioned her, you alluded to Big Kit as being the maternal figure. And Washington Black is someone who from an early age is asking a lot of questions about freedom. He asks Big Kit a question about freedom, and she says, when you are free, you can do anything. You go wherever it is you wanting. You wake up anytime you wanting. When you're free, someone asks you a question, you ain't got to answer. You ain't got to finish no job you don't want to finish. You just leave it. Talk about that kind of conception, that early conception of freedom that Washington Black has, and how that conception evolves when, in fact, he becomes free to a point, or to the extent that he's able to escape from the plantation.
Yeah, so Washington is, he's a very young child on the plantation when he gets taken into the care of Big Kit. He's maybe 4 or 5 years old, and she's really his only source of love and also of knowledge. Big Kit is, what they would have called a saltwater which is somebody who's, been through the Middle Passage. She was born in Africa. She's made the journey. And so he really sees her as this all-knowing figure about all things. Like she's just somebody who has had so much experience in the world that, what she says is for him, it becomes his reality. And he asks her a question about, what does it mean to be free? And her response is to, she recognizes that he's this, he's a young child, and freedom is a very complex thing. So the things that she tells him are very basic. Freedom is the freedom not to work. It's the freedom to not have to answer any question that you don't feel like answering. It's the freedom to just go where you want to go when you feel like going. And although those are very basic, they're freedoms that, he can't even imagine such things. The concept of not working if you don't feel like it, to a slave boy, this is something that is just inconceivable. And so he's astonished by this, and this is something that he carries with him. And so when he unexpectedly finds himself physically free, away from the plantation later on in the book, he really tries to sort of construct his ideas of what it means to be a free man on these things that she's told him, which is, the freedom not to work, or the freedom to just sort of, not answer, these kinds of things. And I think he finds that really this definition of freedom is not enough. It's not all-encompassing. It's not a roadmap. Freedom is so much larger than that.
Well, he recognizes, doesn't he, that even when he manages to escape from the plantation, that he's not free emotionally. He's
exactly.
He's
carrying these psychological burdens from his childhood and from the trauma that he, it's something that he almost initially, he doesn't recognize this. And it's really something that he almost has to have pointed out to him by Tana, that look, there's so much that you're still carrying, or you're a free man, but you refuse to sort of live within the freedom that you can allow, that you can get for yourself. Like he's still very much tied to this relationship to Titch, and this is something that she can't comprehend. But
Tana is his lover.
Tana is his lover, yes. And so there are ways in which he is most definitely psychologically not free, and spiritually not free. He's still, and it makes sense, obviously, when you experience great trauma, that there are things that you carry with you. And so, the whole novel is really a process of him working towards this actualization of a kind of emotional freedom. And I don't even know that he necessarily has achieved it even by the end of the novel, but he's on his way there.
And it's not just, though, emotional freedom and psychological freedom. It's the freedom, or the lack of it, is there's a material dimension as well to it. Is there not? Because really, throughout his life, he's always being watched. He's always being monitored. And it seems as if, there are parallels with the contemporary moment, with the historical moment that we're living through right now, where, ostensibly, in the North American context, Black people, and why don't we focus on Black men in particular, are free, but in many instances don't feel as if they're free, and in fact themselves, their freedom is very much constrained.
Yes, it's true. This idea that you bring up of being surveilled, this is something that is still very much with us. Even something as simple as being able to walk into a shop and not be sort of, tailed, in certain shops, or just this larger idea of, this vulnerability you have within the state. When it comes to policing, this idea that to be, well, not even policing, we can generalize it. This idea of walking through a neighborhood, and people sort of wondering, what are you doing in that neighborhood? These kinds of things that are, shouldn't still be with us, but are still things that mark our lives and dictate freedom of movement, and that really start to, I think, play upon you psychologically. This sense of wrongness, or this sense of that you shouldn't be able to, I guess, enact or play out all of the freedoms that are ostensibly within, I guess, within your hands. That this is not something that that has left us. It's something that is somehow continuing under a different guise.
And it's an assault on your humanity, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. It is an assault on one's humanity. Everyone should have access to, in an ideal world, equal rights and freedoms. But this has not been the case, and it continues to not be the case. And I've been really heartened, I would say, by a lot of the protests of the last few months. Although, just, I guess, given the verdict on Breonna Taylor this week, this felt as though, you really had to ask yourself, what is being changed? There's just so much that I maybe can't get unpacked in the 20 minutes we have left, but certainly this is something that is ongoing.
Mm-hmm. When you are writing, and you wrote this book a couple of years ago, but when you are writing a book of historical fiction like this, how much is your writing informed by the moment in which you're living?
I always feel like historical fiction is a way to, in some respects, kind of work out it gives you a framework for dealing with issues that are directly impacting you in your own life today. But it does it in such a way that, for me at least, I feel like I can really grapple with these ideas of, as you're saying, racism, surveillance, inequity, trauma. All of these are things that I feel like, for me, with the kind of writing that I do, if I can play it out within a framework of the past, it's really, I feel like I have some measure of control over the material in a way that I think I would find it difficult to have to write a book about, say, the moment like this past year. I don't know where I would begin with that, because everything still feels like it's in flux and constantly shifting. But so I do feel like the historical novel is a way of looking at contemporary issues and contemporary situations, but I think they act as reflections to that. And I think that's probably true of historical novels that, don't maybe outwardly seem as though they're dealing with our present day concerns. I think that's always there. I think, built into the project itself, this idea of looking back is, in having that backward glance, you're really asking yourself, well, how are things different today? And are things different? And have things changed? And if they have changed, how has it been for the better? Has it been for the worse? Like you're constantly being asked to, I guess, look at the past through the lens of the present, and that really has you thinking about the era in which you currently live.
Maybe a question is: does Washington Black ever find a safe place? And parallel to that, are there any safe places for Black people today?
I think Washington Black, he's constantly seeking out a safe place, and he's finding that no such place physically exists for him, that there's no one country, one city, one neighborhood, however small the scale is, there's no one place that he can really go where he is going to be fully accepted as a Black man who's scientifically minded, as somebody who's disfigured, as somebody who was once a slave. When he goes into a free society, or a society of in Nova Scotia, of Black people who have not been slaves or not been enslaved, for decades, and he's just, he has the mark of the slave. This is something that really creates this feeling of being an outsider for him. The fact that he doesn't share their history. There's really no place that he can go carrying all of those identities, and feel 100% at home. And I think he comes to realize that later in the book, that really his sense of home and his sense of place is going to have to be self-constructed. And part of that construction is going to be in surrounding himself with people who allow him to fully live out who he is, and who fully respect him and see his talents, and see his goodness, and respect that, and encourage it and reciprocate it. So he realizes that home is really, if this isn't too sentimental, it's to be found within the people that he chooses to make a community with. And that's his maybe, that's as close to his version of an ideal home as he's going to get. And could be that the same is true for us now, that for people who have a sense of being outside of things, your true home is to be found within the communities that you build. Again, that sounds sentimental, but perhaps there's some truth in that.
In spite of the recognition by Washington Black that the freedom that he enjoys has limits, that he is constrained somehow, it's very clear, it's very evident that he feels lucky. He feels fortunate. He recognizes that he has certain opportunities that his, for lack of a better term, brothers and sisters who are enslaved don't have. He has a kind of a survivor's guilt, right? The fact that he's been able to escape from bondage. And I'm wondering, as someone who has enjoyed a measure of success, as a writer in this society, can you relate to this idea of survivor's guilt that Washington Black feels?
Wow, Adrian, that's a big question. No, I don't think I have. I don't think for me that's I guess a through line or a comparison that I would personally make. I don't have that. I would say for him, it makes a great deal of sense because he just, he's somebody who is completely cut off from this community of slaves that really has been his shelter since he was born. Like, this is his kind of patchwork, piecemeal family, or these ties or these bonds that he has in particular to Big Kit, and that she really, for him, she is his family. She is everything. And then to be taken away from that into a life that is, so different from the one that he has left behind, and the one in which she is still inhabiting, a life of toil and hardship. He has deep, deep shame and guilt about that. And it's something that's always with him. I mean, he travels into America and he sees, he's leaving the dock at Norfolk, and he sees the slaves in the fields as they're making their slow way in this carriage, towards a homestead. And he sees them and he understands that, or he hopes at least, that life is behind him. And he feels instantly just so full of guilt and shame for having that thought. And it makes sense. I mean, he's left his beloved in this life, and he has so many more opportunities than he once had. And he's been given the gift of eventually, not having to live in this heightened source of this heightened stress, not having to live constantly stressed out and imperiled, and having some access to an education. All of these things are things that he feels deep guilt about, and for me it only makes sense. Yeah.
So you don't think then there's a kind of a contemporary manifestation of that kind of guilt in Black communities?
Yeah, I would say that. I would definitely say that. Yeah, there most definitely is. Yeah. In fact, it's so interesting. I just finished reading the Neapolitan Quartet, the Elena Ferrante, which is very much not about African diaspora communities, but I bring it up because I thought one of the things that, I found them just astonishingly beautiful and perceptive novels. But one of the things that I could kind of relate to, and that I think a lot of people around me can relate to, is this idea of leaving behind a working class neighborhood and going out and getting educated, and then coming back to that neighborhood. And there's this feeling that she is an outsider there, because she's both being, protected against the violence of the neighborhood, but also she's considered to be not quite one of them anymore, because she has gone away, and even the way she speaks is different. And I thought that was so spot on in terms of these class differences that can come to arise when people do have that kind of movement, I guess. And then there's a lot of inherent sort of guilt and shame attached to that, and also a sense of disinheritance, of not being, not being one of them, for a lack of a better term. And I think that is definitely something that does play itself out in many communities, including within Black communities.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, Esi Edugyan, and I'm going to ask you that question again, because the truth is, to be real, you have, achieved a tremendous amount of success in the society. You have a certain kind of class privilege as a result of the literary success that you've enjoyed. Do you ever feel a certain kind of, for lack of a better term, what is it, imposter syndrome? Or do you feel that sometimes maybe disconnected from communities that you might have been connected to prior to all of this success?
That's a great question, and it's a fair question. And maybe I'll bring up the example. I was sitting in on a meeting that the Writers' Union had organized for specifically for Black Canadian writers the other week, and it was this idea that they wanted to hear some of the difficulties that Black writers were having, getting published, getting agents, just general career issues. And, it was more about writing down the questions and presenting them to the union. And I guess the union finds some way to address these issues rather than, us trying to sort out solutions. But I found it interesting because I did feel myself in that moment to be in an extremely privileged position when I was listening to some of the trials that people were facing and the hurdles that people were having facing when it came to getting their work published. And I remember being in that position. I think maybe, and I felt like, okay, this is something that sitting in this position of privilege, I really have to do something about this. I have to find some way to sort of maybe point out just how large these barriers, are, to people within the industry who actually have the power to make some changes. And these are discussions that I'm having, but it was really something where, I'm very solitary, isolated. I don't really, I'm not constantly talking to a ton of writers or anything. I'm just sort of quietly doing my work. And so it's not something that's maybe always very much in, something that I'm focusing on or thinking about. But this was really driven home for me. And I started to feel, and I remember being a writer starting out and having these same hurdles. And, I think once I was told by a publisher in Holland when they were looking to potentially publish Half-Blood Blues, being told that through my agent, being told that the novel was too Black for Dutch audiences, which is feedback where you're sort of, you can't really do anything with that feedback. It's completely useless. It doesn't. It's just, I don't even want to get into it. But the fact that people are still, there's a whole community who's experiencing these same hurdles. It just, I had a feeling of, okay, how do we change this? How do we shift this? How do we change this? This was my first feeling of wanting to go out and really have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Your books are also about the tremendous potential and possibility that exists within the African body and mind, the Black body and mind. Your book, yes, aspects of the book, big chunks of the book, it's about slavery and freedom, but it's also about genius. George Washington Black is a genius. He is an incredibly gifted individual with tremendous talent, and in some ways the book is a bit of a lament about all of that potential that is so often lost because of the constraints that are put on African and Black bodies and minds.
Yeah, definitely. I had an early reader say to me, this was like a friend who's a writer, say to me that was something that was very illuminating for her, that, that we tend to think of slavery in terms of, a loss of Black bodies, and we're not necessarily always looking at the ways in which people were not, it's essentially, it was a huge loss of Black potential, of Black, what's the word? So I'm starting to flag, but just, here were people who there must have been, there would have been just geniuses and great brilliance among them, people who were never given the chance to enact that and to see their own possibilities. And so, that was something that yeah, I really wanted to focus on that, this great loss of potential.
Mhm.
And I think in a modern sense, I think about it, I was speaking with a friend the other day, and she was saying, she said, given where you grew up, did you ever think that you would find yourself, uh, in the place that you're in? And, I thought that was an apt comment. I think so much of the circumstances of one's life dictate the direction and the fate that life goes in. Just thinking about the neighborhoods into which people are born, and how that can either give you a great advantage or it can hold you back. And just the questions of geography. It's really astonishing, to think of how much geography has shaped human potential. It's just, yeah, there's just so much to unpack and to think about. And these are things that have been on my mind.
Mhm. In the post kind of George Floyd moment, it seems as if writers like yourself, Black writers, writers of African descent, are being seen in ways that they haven't been seen before, perhaps, in terms of the kind of attention and the kinds of opportunity, even to participate in conversations. You've taken on that. You've taken on that responsibility. It feels as if you're more present in the kind of general discourse that you are intervening. You're choosing, as a writer, to intervene much more in a much more kind of intentional way. And I'm wondering, what you see as being your particular role at this moment as a Black writer, as an African Canadian writer. What time is it for you? Is this your African time? Is it? What time is it?
I'm somebody who, I've always maintained, I'm somebody who doesn't like to sort of wade into any kind of a political fray, but I felt compelled after George Floyd's death to kind of, yeah, to make certain statements and to sort of, I guess maybe to point out the ways in which people have been complacent and the ways in which their activism is needed. But I hope my way was always to do it in a way that leaves space for others to speak. I really don't want to be somebody who is, I guess, taking up all the airtime on that. I think that there are others who are speaking as well, and who speak more eloquently than myself about this. Writers like Desmond Cole, Robin Maynard. I mean, there are so many just utterly brilliant and fascinating Black voices, and I'm really glad that they're getting more exposure and that we're talking about their ideas as well. I think this is really a time when people are listening, and so you have to make the most of that and hope it creates an impact, so that it doesn't just become the few months that people were listening to Black voices and then we can kind of move on. This is something that, in order to actually affect lasting structural change, this conversation needs to continue.
And what's the most important message that you want to convey right now, Esi Edugyan? What do you want to say? What do you want people to kind of leave with?
I think that for some people, I mean, it's sort of hard to fathom the lives of others, isn't it? It's hard to fathom others' realities. And, racism is something that I think a lot of people would put in the bad category, but I think they don't really. Maybe some people don't have full idea of how racism plays itself out in more insidious and smaller ways. And I think that I guess maybe I would hope that people would continue to listen, to the voices who are discussing this, and that we can continue to have these conversations that are so, that are painful but necessary. I really think that this is truly, as I've said, the only way that structural change will come about. And I feel like we don't want to lose the momentum of this moment, that things have to change.
Mm-hmm. What's next for you? What are, if you can divulge, what are some of the things that you're working on right now that you can share with us?
So I'm writing just a suite of essays right now, just a small suite of essays, and also trying to work on a new novel, but it's hard. I mean, of course, with the coronavirus, we had our children home, as I'm sure you can identify with, Adrian. Yeah. So my kids were home, from March onwards, and they've just kind of gone back to school now. So it was really amazing that, that first day when they were back, of like, oh my goodness, I can actually hear my own thoughts, and I actually have the space to write something, and so I these are the things that I'm working on, and hoping to maybe have something out next year, but we'll see. Yeah.
Well, Esi Edugyan, it's always such a delight, a pleasure and honor to sit down.
Likewise, Adrian.
With you. Thanks so much for spending your Sunday with us, at least part of your Sunday, and best of luck in all of your future endeavors, and best to all of your loved ones as well in this moment.
Oh, thank you, Adrian. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in person at some point. It'd be lovely.
Breaking bread. I'll cook you something.
Oh yeah, you're a good cook.
I know you don't think I can cook, but I can throw down a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to hold you to that.
Esi, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, take care.
You too.
Sticky, spicy, sweet. I will get you arrested. Very, very easy. Relax, everybody.